Now entering the Bitcoin Podcast Network.
Today's episode is brought to you by KeepKey, the easy, safe, and simple way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and many other digital assets. There's no time like the present to protect yourself from hackers, malware, and viruses. Visit keepkey.com to order your secure hardware wallet today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount. And I also have a Patreon, and on that people pay me money, for food or cheese or saltines or whatever. But you know what? I don't want your filthy nation state fiat. I would, however, take your 5-star reviews though. So if you like the show, please rate it on iTunes or Google Play or whatever. I really would appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Okay, so in today's episode, I chat with Jeremy Heimans, who wrote this great book called New Power, and we chat about a variety of things. We chat about New Power, which is this crowd-based power that's starting to exist within networks, crowds. We also chat about how that new power kind of manifests itself into old power institutions, aka if you think about like Black Lives Matter, how does that actually end up affecting the world? We chat about also a little bit about crypto and like Jeremy's worries about crypto and thinking about who is getting power and if the internet was the transition of power from non-nerds to nerds, how is crypto transferring power? And then also a secondary question here around supporting public goods and how does the government support public goods? How can something like crypto support public goods? It's nice to get Jeremy's kind of fresh perspective here, a very crowd-based perspective towards crypto. And then we also chat about something that I've been asking more of my interviewees is like, hey, making them really define what is good. So for Jeremy, I think he's definitely more on the, hey, I think something like Black Lives Matter, Me Too is good, and something like Make America Great Again or the NRA is less good. And so we kind of dive into that and say, why are some things good and some things not good? And for him, it's all about, or not all, but primarily about power and kind of thinking about historically marginalized groups. So that's fun. We also chat about Boaty McBoatface, which is a great example of new power gone wrong. And kind of one big thing that I want to hit on here before letting you listen to the interview is we chat about this a bit in the show, Jeremy and I do, and it's this idea that if we have this internet of information and we have our networked info, we have this permissionless, information transfer at zero marginal cost, and that's pretty crazy. It allows for things like aggregators like Google and Facebook and platforms like Uber and Airbnb, and it allows for these hashtag-based new power memes, these crowd-based memes like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and Make America Great Again, and also allows for some of these new kinds of networked protests like the Arab Spring. And if that internet of information allows for this kind of new power, well, then we should start to think, well, what will the blockchain and the internet of value enable? Because that'll be a networked value transfer, not just info transfer. It'll be the permissionless value transfer at zero marginal cost. And so as that happens, we can think, well, these things like this traditional new power, whether it's the aggregators of the platforms or the hashtag-based memes and the kind of fragile networked protest, how will those things change once this value layer is automatically added? Imagine that, how does the new power essentially get instantiated if we're in a world where Black Lives Matter, instead of needing to translate that meme into some kind of weird old power institution like a nonprofit, if it instead can more easily and more permissionlessly connect that powerful info, that powerful meme, to some kind of powerful value institution base, capital base that some things like blockchain might enable through tokenization, what have you. So that's the idea here. And when you start to think from this perspective, you can start to think, hey, Bitcoin and Ethereum are really, they're a form of networked protest. And instead of being a networked protest that is just information based instead and fragile, instead it's value based and has capital behind it and is anti-fragile. So that's the idea here. And so as you listen to today's episode, start to think about how these kind of blockchain based institutions kind of will manifest themselves in a new way that might be similar or different from New Power. So with that, enjoy today's episode with Jeremy. Okay, Hello everybody, my name is Reese Lindmark and you're listening to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future. In this podcast we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world, and we have a couple different series that focus on different system scopes. And today we're focusing on Series A macro systems, aka where are we as humanity headed? And to explore that question, I'm very excited to introduce Jeremy Heimans to the show. Jeremy is the CEO of Purpose and the author of a new book, New Power. Jeremy, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Great to be here, Reese.
Yeah, excited to chat. So Jeremy, first at a high level, let's just give us an overview. What is New Power?
Well, New Power is, the way we see it is, it's kind of this critical skill you need in the 21st century. And it's both a method and a mindset. And that is this ability to harness the energy of these connected crowds that are all around us. So to operate in a world of crowds, we think requires a pretty different set of skills and a pretty different orientation to the world. And the book is really about how to do that. It's about the implications of that. And it's about a world in which, models of power that are based on these new forms of participation and peer coordination are battling and balancing with models of power that remain traditional, that they're based on what one knows, what one owns, what one has that no one else does. And those things are increasingly contest, I think, for the way humanity evolves and for the future.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's why that's a great overview, and that's why I've chatted about it on my show before. And two quick notes there. One is that you talk about this networked. I think about it as like a networked human organism. There's 4 billion smartphones by 2020. There are going to be 4 billion like interconnected smartphones. Like that's crazy.
Yeah,
so why wouldn't you leverage that? And then the other thing you talk about there is like when you think about it, it's this participatory aspect, and that's why I think of this as like using the prefix co all the time. Co-creating, co-evolve, co-whatever.
Yeah.
That kind of gets this participatory vibe. So for you, when I think about New Power, I really connect it to this book, Machine Platform Crowd, and this final piece, crowd versus core, and how we're transitioning some way from cores to these crowds that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is New Power, how much is New Power about the crowd? And is New Power also about anything that's not kind of crowd-based?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think your comment about participation is one that we should dwell on, right?
Yeah.
So our argument here is not there are 4 billion smartphones, therefore the world has changed. It's actually about the way that ubiquitous connectivity affects both the way people behave and what they expect, and the models of economic, social, political organization that become possible, or that become more viable relative to other models, right? So that's really important to know. And so, we can think about an analogy we often use, a very simple analogy to help people understand the difference between old and new power, is the difference between Tetris and Minecraft. So Tetris is a block-based game where things are falling on top of your head. You've got to sort things out into neat rows, but you really don't have very much agency. But in a world in which, young kids today are growing up with Minecraft, they have this radically different expectation of their ability to shape their world. And to your point, they're shaping that world often in a coordinated and collaborative way in order to get things done. And so their experience of the world is not one in which you're simply subjected to a bunch of rules that are imposed on you from the outside, but one in which you can make the rules. So that's important. It's a big shift. It should not be confused with those people necessarily being more powerful, in the sense that, and we talk about this a lot in the book, that a more participatory world is not one in which power necessarily flows more evenly, because the difference is you can have agency, but your ability to shape outcomes in real ways can still be constrained. And we can talk about more of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That reminds me of this, when people imagine the new early age internet, it's like, oh my god, it's going to disintermediate all the things, and like power will flow to the edges. And then we saw that actually, when you have zero marginal cost of distribution, that creates these massive aggregators like Google and Facebook. And so, as you're saying this, it's not like just because people can participate doesn't mean they can actually exercise their power in the same way.
Well, it means, if you think about Facebook as a good example, so yes, all of us now have the ability to connect with people seamlessly in ways that were impossible a decade and a half ago. That's true. Facebook facilitates that. On the other hand, if you think about the economic value that's being created, if you think about the way that platform then shapes outcomes, behavior, feelings, we actually have very little agency over those things. So that's the paradox. Yes, we do have an ability to participate. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are left with more power. And that's, a central challenge with these models.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's part of why the blockchain and crypto stuff is so compelling, because theoretically it promises to address that because of the disintermediation of some of those platform-like players.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and let's actually dive down that for just a half second, just to explore our crypto fancy for a bit, and just to tell our listeners, it's not like Jeremy is a crypto expert in any means. He's clearly interested, because who wouldn't be? But so Jeremy, do you think, when I think about some of these, these kind of new power kinds of things where people can come together around memes, like people come together around Me Too or Black Lives Matter or MAGA or whatever, but then there's not really, they're kind of information based, and there's not really kind of a capital layer, like a financial capital layer around them. When I think about blockchain and crypto and how it's creating this internet of value, the money itself can flow, I feel like it might be able to kind of elevate something like what was purely just a meme, or like a quick new power-based meme, can actually elevate to the level of institution, because it has kind of capital flowing behind it from blockchain-based tokens or whatever. Does that seem... What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's think about what the practical applications of that are, right? So what I'm hearing, which is right, is that, out of a cultural moment like Me Too, if there are things for which capital is useful, if there are new forms of economic value that can be created that reinforce the goals of a movement like that, is it rewarding companies that, that are supportive of policies in this area and punishing those who are not, or if it's supporting women-owned businesses, or any number of things speculatively, right? Then clearly what blockchain and crypto does is it makes that much easier, quicker, and more scalable, right? Now that isn't to say that it's impossible now. So the phenomenon of crowdfunding is a phenomenon that has already made a significant impact without the need for the further kind of step of crypto or the further disintermediation that the blockchain represents. And so already I think we have a clue to that future, which is the fact that there are these crowdfunding platforms that are allowing people to move money in a crowd-driven way, rather than in a way that relies on the concentration of, a few small donors or investors. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes, but I think the use cases are the things that we need to kind of get clearer on. And what does the blockchain unlock that is different to more conventional forms of crowd-backed
funding. What have you. And I think you're right to say it's a yes and situation where it's already being done today. And that's actually a question I wanted to pose to you, which was something that I am interested by. Is like, so for something like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, whatever, something like MAGA, like Make America Great Again, was kind of created from, it was created essentially by Trump or by Trump's crew or whatever, and it was already connected to the institution of power in that way. Something like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, those feel like they were kind of hashtags first. And then did they transition? How did those get kind of instantiated in the world and not just purely like, this is more of a meme, but how did it get, how did it turn into nonprofits, or what happened there?
Well, if you think about the Me Too trajectory, I think it's a really interesting one. So firstly, it's important to note that there was a woman, Tarana Burke, who was using this hashtag for campaigning that was more focused specifically on women of color for a decade. But it took a tweet from Alyssa Milano, of all people, to kind of cause this, the beginning of this huge wave. Now that was, interestingly, if you study the history of this, in the year before, after the Access Hollywood tape was released about Trump, a little mini Me Too sprung up about sexual harassment and assault called Not Okay, hashtag Not Okay. But I think one of the things that's interesting about the difference between those two is that Me Too was actually much more clearly actionable. So Me Too kind of invited people to actually share a story rather than just condemn. And so the actionable nature of it and ultimately the extensibility of it is part of why it caught fire. Now, what happens with these ideas is these are ideas, and these ideas then of course take many different shapes, and none of these things are being kind of coordinated by one person at the top, right? But that huge increase in energy and salience spawned things like the Time's Up organization. But the Time's Up organization does not seek to speak for the entire Me Too movement. And many things have been spawned in many geographies and many industries that all look different. So the strength of these kinds of memes that become more than memes is that they don't run into the same problem necessarily of being subject to the whims of individual leaders. The vicissitudes of that means that if those leaders fight with each other or those leaders are caught doing bad things, that the whole movement can collapse. The movements like this are more in one way more resilient because of how decentralized they are. In another way, they can be very hard to coalesce by definition, and so that means that some of them just fizzle out very quickly. And so part of the way we think about this is what is the relay needed between old power and new power to take the energy of these massive new power currents like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and make sure that they get captured and moved into the kind of old power world and to the changes that need to happen. And that's always the dance. I think people tend to think of these two things as mutually exclusive. So the way people have these debates, they're in one camp or the other. They're like, oh, I think Me Too is fantastic, or Black Lives Matter, or oh, this will achieve nothing because it's not an organization. Where's the leader? And neither views are right. You actually need both approaches to push the whole change process through
forward. That makes sense. That reminds me of there's a lot there. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind on that last point is Zeynep Tufekci wrote this great book called Twitter and Tear Gas, and she talks in that about these nonviolent protests and how they have and especially how Facebook changed enabled in some ways the Arab Spring, and how there's the kind of what you're talking about here is on one side there's the signaling piece, which is, hey, we have this big momentum here. It's easier to get 500,000 people together than it was before. So let's do that. And then there's the capabilities piece and the underlying capacities piece, which is how do you take that and then turn it into long-term change? And so I guess just to explore that for a bit, how should people do that?
Well, I think the thing we say in the book is, unfortunately, some of the best exemplars of this are actually bad actors. What I would classify as bad actors, other people would love. So the NRA does this pretty well, right? The NRA has a very strong old power repertoire, so it knows how to inspire fear. It knows how to exercise kind of coercive power in the corridors of power of Congress across the country. It does that very well. It uses its brand, its institutional might, its resources. It also is surprisingly good at letting go of control and cultivating a kind of sprawling grassroots beyond its own formal membership that provides the energy and intensity that they can then throw fuel on as they see it crop up. So it's a very effective combination.
They're good at both.
They're very good at both. So I think some of the best actors have both of these skills and know when to use which, right, in order to produce the right outcomes. And so I think in a way the Trump story is also a bit of a story of that.
Definitely.
So yes, he originates the slogan "Make America Great Again." But he also really does an effective job of sending a signal to his digital crowd, to his sprawling, decentralized social media army, that they should do their worst, that they should be creative, that he's not going to impose any control over their message or any of those things, but rather, to the contrary, he's going to encourage them. So it's a very different posture to okay, here's my slogan, everybody repeat it. And if anybody diverts from that, I'm going to distance myself, right? So that strategy is a new power strategy because he's cultivating the agency of his crowd, and that was very important in the, all the social media sentiment analysis of 2016 shows that Trump did have higher intensity of support and favorability on social media, even when he had lower favorability in public opinion polls. And that mattered.
Yeah, exactly, and it was powerful. That's you hit on that point earlier, where it's like, hey, if something is, think about Me Too versus what was the other one that was not Me Too, that was condemning,
not okay.
Where it's like, hey, when you're creating one of these new power things, you have to think, how can we make it actionable? How can we make it remixable? All those kind of things.
And that was the sort of one of the big themes of the work.
So
cryptocurrency is vibrant and exciting, but it's not without its share of bad actors. Exchanges and personal accounts can get hacked, computers can be infected with malware. Left unprotected, your digital wealth is up for grabs. Don't let yourself be a victim. KeepKey is the safest and simplest way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and other tokenized assets. This hardware wallet is a separate device that you control. Brought to you by the pioneering team at Shapeshift, KeepKey works with the wallet software on your computer to manage your private keys and transactions. Your device is PIN protected, which provides protection if it falls into the wrong hands. Its large display lets you carefully view and approve every transaction. And if your KeepKey is ever lost or stolen, you can safely recover your device without compromising its private keys. The bottom line, you'll sleep easier knowing that your digital wealth is safe and secure. Visit keepkey.com to order yours today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount.
So thinking about, and one thing that is kind of spicy with this stuff is that you have power, and power can be used for good and bad things. And you just talked about, there are, in my mind, and I think in many of my listeners' mind, but not some of them, something like Me Too and Black Lives Matter feels good. It's changing, historical racism and sexism, saying let's empower these people, while something like, maybe, Trump or the NRA might feel kind of bad for. And so I think a question that's an interesting question, this almost isn't even related to new power as a thing, but just for you personally.
Sure.
What to you says, hey, this is a thing, I think that this is going to be a good thing for the world. This is something that I want new power to put its weight behind.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think a couple of ways to think about this. One, is it actually making more people more powerful? Mm-hmm. And is it doing so in a way that produces better social outcomes and doesn't harm other groups of people, particularly people who've been historically marginalized?
Yeah.
So, that's the difference between white nationalism and Black Lives Matter. White nationalism is based on an ideology of hatred of other ethnic groups, and it's about helping a group that historically has been more powerful, right, to state the obvious. So that's why social movements do that, like Black Lives Matter are so important. So I think that the litmus test is partly about the distribution of power, it's partly about the social outcomes, and your view of social outcomes, of course, is going to be informed by what you think a better society looks like, and we're unashamed in the book about saying, this is our worldview. It's a progressive worldview. We want a more open world. We want a more compassionate world, etc. Within that frame, we make the argument that we need to help climate scientists get better at prosecuting their argument because they're tackling climate deniers who want to deny reason. We make the argument that we want to help those who are trying to create tolerance and support for refugees and immigrants at a time when nativists are winning. So, that's our bias, but you can use the ideas in the book for better or worse, whatever your ideology, and they will be useful.
Yep, that makes sense. I feel like, and as you say there, I do think that this question of, and going back to who has power in the world and who also historically has had power is a great way to answer what can be good. You say, hey, look, if we were in a different reality, maybe it's the year 3000, and in fact it's the case that women and minorities or not white people have had too much power for the last however many years.
Right.
You can imagine where we're like, hey, we should have something like white nationalists, white lives matter, something like that could exist then, but
in the deepest theoretical sense,
exactly.
In a way that belies all of human history.
Yes, exactly.
But yes,
exactly.
I get what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah, we I guess this is my way to say that when it's not like we can agree with people of that variety, given a certain status quo, but the current status quo is not that. The current status quo is one in which the power has clearly been people like you and me, rich white males for a long time. So let's not have that.
Exactly.
Okay, so kind of taking it a step back then from that kind of moral piece and thinking more about a word that I just used that academics use called new institutional economics, which is essentially how institutions co-evolve through time. So you can imagine, when the nation state really became a thing around like Industrial Revolution time and kind of the church and religion kind of lost more power, how did those things happen? And now, as we're starting to see some of these new power dynamics occur, how do you see, and you talked about this a bit, but how do you see stuff like, new power-based memes or kind of new power-based crowd, leveraging, how are those going to kind of co-evolve with and compete with things like nation states or companies and firms and things like that?
Yeah. Well, look, so I think already what we've seen is the rise, of course, of the platform, which is a way of, platforms like Facebook and Twitter and even Airbnb are ways of coalescing and structuring that new power that we describe. So the people who are effective at doing that are winning in many ways, right? Including the people who are frankly co-opting that participatory energy. So, a big theme of our age, if you think about institutions changing, is that, we live in a world in which there's deep skepticism of institutions. So when you ask people in surveys, do they trust big business, or do they trust government? The big social institutions of our world, they say absolutely not, right? And yet we've seen this massive shift in power toward platforms that in many ways are institutions, are acting like institutions, are capturing, are extractive, and yet people still have a reasonably different attitude to those. They don't really yet see them as institutions. I think we're beginning to see how with Facebook and others, people are beginning to develop a kind of political consciousness about these actors, so that they're starting to see how they're almost as powerful as nation states, and we need to start treating them that way. Demanding things of them, trying to take our power back in context. So I think that's a really interesting evolution. I think it'll be really interesting to see if a further evolution of that is that these all-powerful platforms get further usurped by the development of blockchain-based means. If that happens, there are still going to be very powerful institutions that mediate that. And we know that, right? The question is, will the role and power of that institution be different from the perspective of the things that matter, which is who gets the value, what aggregate social outcomes occur, who benefits, who has a voice in the decisions about how they're governed, etc. And so that, I think, is the next frontier of that conversation.
Totally. And likely it'll still be a while out. But
and my concern, to be clear, is if you look at, I think it matters who the people are who are running these things.
Exactly.
And one of the things that, we saw is that the transfer of power from some of the traditional companies to the big new tech companies didn't involve any change in that, highly educated rich white guys from, the US and a couple of other countries dynamic. At all. Like, they had different fashion sense. They were wearing like hoodies this time, but otherwise they were the same, right? And the same class of people bestowed, but reproduced that relationship, and that continues, right? If you look at the power of VCs, if anything, the only redistribution of power that happened was from non-nerds to nerds. So that is also, I think, being replicated, and you would know this better than I would, in the early dynamics of the crypto and blockchain worlds, where clearly it's the same, it's the same characters, right? Maybe even nerdier.
Exactly. And that's funny because, and I do agree, and there are kind of two ways to think about this. There's like the identity piece, and there's like, who are the people, and are they, they're rich, white, Western dudes, like that's kind of one side of things. And we would like that to be much more diverse from an identity perspective. But I think almost I'm not sure if you could say more important, but definitely also super important, is whether or not the people who are there, who are kind of starting things, who have the power, what are their values and what are their value sets? And I think that hopefully within the crypto world, maybe a quick example here is this thing called Give Crypto, which is a bunch of kind of top crypto folks who are all just actively self-taxed themselves, aka gave a bunch of money to charity to give it to this thing called Give Directly or Give Directly type thing. And so hopefully the hope, and we'll see if that actually occurs, but that the blockchain crypto world has decentralization of power itself as a value, and that value, as the people gain power, that some of them may have similar identities, but their goal is to decentralize power, and that they'll have kind of actively non-accumulation, self-taxing mindsets to give power back to the system. That's the hope.
And I think a couple of things to look out for. Like one is how the capital flows to finance these new players, right? Because I think one of the reasons we keep getting stuck in this endless loop is that platforms like Facebook and Twitter are funded by the same traditional sources of capital that demand traditional returns and a set of behaviors that are not self-taxing redistributive behaviors, right? So that's point one. And then point two, I think, is to think about is, yes, I think it would be great if the values of this group were public spirited, but there is also this question and tension between moments where decentralization can solve problems and moments where we need old power, we need institutions, we need kind of public. We don't want to just disaggregate preferences. We actually need preferences to be determined at a public level with a common good mindset, which cannot purely be solved through a bunch of disaggregated activities and transactions. And I think that's where my concern is, that the ideology of some of those guys, is they just don't have a precedent for that, because that's not how they've advanced in the world. And that's the big clash that we see again and again. And we explore that clash in values a lot in the book. And I think our position is we kind of I feel like we have one eye to the 21st century and one eye to the 20th, can understand the merits in a way of both views of the world, and are really interested in models that kind of get the best out of both views.
I agree with that. I think there's a funny, the blockchain crypto world is very libertarian by nature. That's kind of right. And the question is, and I think some of them might think, and I think this to some extent, that you can achieve things that have traditionally been done by kind of nation-state government stuff, like public good kind of things, that you might be able to achieve some of those same outcomes just through these weird new
I think that's true of some things.
Exactly.
But decision making, again, if all this becomes is the aggregation of a set of atomized activities, then it's only the people who are participating in that are really going to benefit. So there's this additional layer, that governments are used for to make, public interest decisions regardless of level of participation or level of investment. I'm stating the obvious, but I think it's really important. It's important to grapple with this stuff as we think about this new power world, because we're absolutely headed in a direction of further decentralization, which, like you, I'm really excited about that for a bunch of reasons. But I think we want all of those people to read books about government and why it was created and why there might be some reasons to keep it around for a little bit longer, etc.
Totally. I agree. And I think, and that's governance, and I think it's kind of staying ours, but it's also kind of weird. Like, we've had the noun government for a long period of time, but we don't really use governance that often.
That's true.
What you're talking about is governance, and how do we make decisions, and how does that happen with both these blockchain-based protocols? How does it happen with these new platforms, and kind of can it be more of a platform co-op-y style way, where Uber actually, where the drivers themselves have ownership and power?
That's right.
So one thing that I guess, let's actually transition to one final thing here, because we're close to running out of time. Something that I couldn't end this episode without discussing is Boaty McBoatface. and what happens when something like when some of these new power dynamics get co-opted. So could you kind of tell the story of Boaty McBoatface?
Sure.
And what it kind of shows. Yeah.
So basically there was a British institution, a government institution called the National Environmental Research Council that had built a very expensive shipping vessel that was going to go and do £300 million, I think it was. They were going to go and explore the world doing environmental research. So they thought, well, we put all this money in, we may as well make a bit of a fanfare about it. So they tried to engage the crowd. So they announced this campaign called #NameOurShip. And the first sign that this might be going wrong was that they issued a press release in which they told the crowd what they thought they should name the ship.
Oh no.
They gave suggestions that were very august, like Endeavour and Shackleton and Adventurer. And of course, when you do that, and you don't have cultivated any of these new power skills and communities, the crowd had other ideas. Yeah. So what would have otherwise been a very obscure contest became a kind of global cultural phenomenon when someone proposed the name Boaty McBoatface, and people swamped this site to vote for that. And then other people, by the way, came up with other great names like I like big boats and I cannot lie.
Nice.
And so anyway, this is really a kind of parable of our age, in the sense that you then have this old power institution that everybody's gotten really excited. They've got the public engagement that they were craving, but their boss, the science minister in the UK, was like, this is outrageous. This is trivializing science. The internet is stupid. I think it was actually the word with the internet was trivializing science. The internet as a whole was blamed. And so they caved to that pressure. They ended up naming the boat Sir David Attenborough, which is hard to argue against.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And they named a small submarine vessel that was part of the ship Boaty McBoatface, but they basically sunk Boaty at sea. It's a good story of like both how institutions that are steeped in the old power world use these new skills, but also about the missed opportunities, right? Because really they could have created this really amazing phenomenon around this boat if they actually had the guts to call it Boaty McBoatface. And so I think one of the things that people focus on, particularly old power players, they focus on the risks more than the missed opportunities. So everybody's worried about the scandal that happens and saying something too outrageous or whatever. But actually, the missed opportunity to create intensity and engagement in your crowd in the 21st century, that equation changes. And actually, in many ways, you're better off pissing a few people off if it means that you're inspiring and engaging people that could really show up for you.
I love that. I think that's funny, and I think that there's a version of that is like on social media these days. You'll have companies who the social media accounts are run by new age millennial folks who are funny, and they're just like hating on people.
Totally.
And it's like, this is funny. This is good. This is great.
It is interesting. And then you see the dissonance where there's some scandal or some problem, and then there's some really carefully worded statement that gets posted on Twitter, and then what happens is the crowd's like, this is not enough, and they demand a return to that kind of frankness. And so you watch this journey of that happening, which is an interesting evolving dynamic.
Yeah, it's fun. Well, with that, we're pretty much out of time. But Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on the show. For my listeners, by the way, I have read New Power, and it is a great book. Especially, it's good for something that we didn't talk about much today is there's both kind of the macro themes from a non-blockchain perspective, which is actually very powerful and really great about how new power is changing the world, and then also Jeremy outlines a bunch of kind of actionable things that you can do. So it's like we talked about some of them about how to make your memes actionable and how to make them accessible or whatever. But so there's a bunch of like actionable items within it, which is great. So I'd recommend it. Just Google New Power, I guess. And Jeremy, how can people find you on the internet, on like Twitter?
Sure. On Twitter, you can find me at Jeremy Heimans, Heimans.
Oh, perfect. Well, with that, thank you so much, Jeremy. And by the way, a final note to my listeners: if you want to support me in I would argue a new power way, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/RhysLindmark. That's patreon.com/RhysLindmark. Okay, great, everybody. Goodbye. Sweet.
Awesome.